The vote was done before the last senator finished speaking. 53-9. The Terran Sovereign Republic would send a bride to the Dorith Empire. They would send her wrapped in silk and silence, with a treaty written in language so careful it almost hid the word surrender. Almost. President Aldous Caldwell did not watch the tally board when the numbers settled. He was already looking at his daughter. Lyra sat in the gallery above the Senate floor, her hands folded in her lap, her face still. She had the kind of stillness that people mistook for calm. Her father knew better. He had raised her after her mother died. He had watched her sit exactly like that the night before her first diplomatic exam, the night before her first field assignment, the night she was told her unit had been ambushed and 3 of her colleagues had not come back. She was not calm. She was counting. She was always counting something, measuring something, turning a problem in her head the way other people turn stones in their hands. She met his eyes from across the chamber and gave one small nod. He nodded back. Neither of them smiled. The Dorith ultimatum had arrived 11 months ago on a transmission that burned out the relay station it came through. The message was short. One royal daughter from the ruling human family, given in bonded marriage to High Warlord Ro Van of the Dorith Empire, as proof of good faith and permanent submission. In exchange, the Empire would not glass the 14 human colony worlds that lay beyond the edge of Sol's reach. The Dorith did not call it a threat. They called it an offer of mercy. Humanity's generals had been honest in closed session. They could not win a war against the Dorith. Not now. Their fleet was a third the size it needed to be. Their weapons were good, but not good enough. They needed time. 10 years, maybe 15, to build what they would need. Lyra had walked into her father's office that same night and told him she was going. He had said nothing for a long time. Then he had said, "I won't order you." She had said, "I know. I'm not asking for an order." What followed over the next 2 months was not a farewell. It was a planning session. Lyra met in private with Commander Davin Holt, a man who had spent 12 years doing things for the Republic that were not written in any public record. He was not large or loud. He had pale eyes and a habit of standing very close to walls, and he had once talked his way out of a Dorith border detention facility using nothing but a language he had taught himself from recordings in 3 weeks. He was exactly the kind of man you wanted if you were walking into a trap and intended to walk back out. He would travel to Dorith Prime as part of her ceremonial staff, listed on the manifest as a cultural attaché. Lyra spent 2 months memorizing the Dorith language from the same recordings he had used. She practiced in the shower, in the car, in the minutes before sleep. She was not fluent when she boarded the transport. She was close enough. The Dorith dreadnought that came to collect her was called the Voritha's Fist. It was the largest ship Lyra had ever stood next to, and it was nothing like a human vessel. It had no softness to it, no curve, nothing built with comfort in mind. It was a weapon shaped like a building. It smelled of metal and something that she could not name, something that made her back teeth ache. The Dorith crew who came to escort her aboard did not speak to her. They walked around her, as though she were furniture that had been left in an inconvenient place. One of them, a lieutenant with a long diagonal scar running from his left temple to his jaw, looked at her for a moment with something between curiosity and contempt, the way a person looks at an insect before deciding it is not worth stepping on. "Your kind dies in decades," he said in Dorith. He did not expect her to understand. "You are a fruit already rotting from inside." Lyra looked up at him. She was not a short woman, but the Dorith were very tall, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. She did it without hesitation. "Yes," she said, in Dorith, quietly and without heat. "That is why we do not waste time." The lieutenant blinked. Just once. Just enough. She walked past him and up the boarding ramp. Her quarters on the ship were clean and cold and sized for a Dorith, which meant the bed was nearly too wide to cross in one step, and the ceiling was so high it felt like standing inside a warehouse. There was one narrow viewport. Davin's room was 2 doors down. They had agreed not to be seen speaking more than necessary. Lyra spent the first day doing what she always did in a new place. She walked every corridor she was permitted to walk. She counted guards and measured their rotation timing. She watched the Dorith eat and move and interact with one another, noting who deferred to whom, who looked at who with resentment they thought they were hiding. She asked quiet questions of the one crew member assigned to serve her, a young Dorith female whose name translated roughly as second of the morning watch. and whose job was clearly to observe Lyra as much as to help her. Lyra was pleasant to her and fed her nothing useful and learned a great deal from what she volunteered. The ship jumped to faster-than-light travel on the second day. The stars outside the viewport smeared and went strange. Lyra stood at the glass for a long time. Earth was long gone from any visible angle, not a point of light, not even an absence she could point to. Just gone. Behind her was the life she had lived. Ahead of her was a warlord she had never met and a palace she had never seen and an empire that had decided her species was worth less than a trade arrangement. She pressed her fingers against the cold viewport. She was 24 years old. She spoke 7 languages. She had read everything ever translated from Dorith historical records. She had a dislocated shoulder that had healed slightly wrong and a scar on her right palm from a field exercise that had gone badly and a mind that her professors had once called, with some exasperation, pathologically strategic. She thought about the intel Davin had given her in the last briefing. The Doric Vault. Somewhere beneath whatever palace the Dorith had put on their homeworld, there was a sealed chamber containing something old and very dangerous. The Dorith had built a religion around not opening it. Someone, apparently, had decided the religion was optional. Lyra did not know yet what it was. She intended to find out. She pulled her fingers from the viewport and went to sit at the small desk bolted to the wall of her quarters. She took out the writing tablet she had brought and began making notes, in a personal shorthand that would look like nothing to anyone who found it, about everything she had observed in the past 2 days. She wrote for 3 hours. Then she slept, briefly and completely, and woke before the ship's night cycle ended. The Voritha's fist moved through darkness toward Dorith Prime, carrying its cargo. The cargo was already working. The bonding ceremony lasted 6 hours. Lyra stood through all of it. The Dorith ritual required the lesser party her to remain standing while the warlord and his court sat in a tiered ring around the central stone floor. There were drums. There were long passages of spoken Dorith that the officiating priest recited without pause, a liturgy built for an audience that would understand it and not for a human woman who was only supposed to be decorative. Priests moved around her in a circle, burning something that smelled like copper and dried grass, pressing a series of small metal seals against her wrists and collarbone that left marks she did not look at until later. The marks did not hurt. She noted that they were not random, each one had a specific placement, and she filed that observation away for when she could look at Dorith's symbolic writing properly. Rovan watched her from his seat on the high stone chair at the center of the ring. He was larger than she had expected, and she had expected large. He was not the kind of large that was fat or slow. He was the kind that was simply built differently, wider through the chest and shoulders than any human man she had ever seen, with 4 parallel ritual scars running from his left jaw to his left temple, and hands that could have wrapped around her head with room to spare. He wore no armor for the ceremony, just dark cloth and metal at his wrists and throat. He watched her the way a general watches a map, looking for something. She did not know what. She gave him nothing to find. When the priest finally spoke the closing words and the drums stopped, the silence was so sudden it felt physical. The bonding is complete, the priest announced in Dorith. The human female is now of the warlord's house. Let all courts recognize it. There was a sound from the assembled noble class. It was not applause. It was something lower, more rhythmic, a kind of collective exhale that Lyra now knew meant acknowledgement in formal Dorith ceremony. She had read about it. Hearing it directed at her was different from reading about it. She kept her face still and her hands at her sides. The feast that followed was the real arena. Dorith noble culture ran on status performance. Every interaction in that hall was a dominance calculation. Who sat nearest whom, who ate first, who was spoken to and who was not, who laughed at whose words, all of it was a continuous negotiation that the Dorith conducted with the fluency of people who had been trained for it since birth. Lyra watched it the way she had watched the crew on the ship, quietly and completely, eating the food in front of her without making a face even though it tasted like iron and bark. The noble class spoke about her in Dorith throughout the meal. "She is very small," said the woman to Rovan's left, a broad-shouldered lord whose name Lyra had already memorized. "Does it eat enough?" "Human females of this size are apparently healthy," said another, 3 seats down. "Their biology is different. Their biology is inferior. I have read the reports. They are soft inside. The organs are not reinforced. And the lifespan is embarrassing. She will be dead before his youngest child learns to fight. What does he plan to do with it after? They spoke as though she were a piece of furniture that had recently been installed, and they were discussing whether it matched the room. None of them looked directly at her. She ate a piece of something that had the texture of overcooked root vegetable and looked pleasantly at the middle distance and listened to every word. She was 3 weeks from being fluent. She was already there. After the feast, she was shown to her rooms in the Citadel's East Wing. They were large rooms, better appointed than the ship had been, with actual windows that looked out over the Dorith capital. The city was lit in deep orange and red from some mineral in the stone that caught the light of their sun strangely. It looked, at night, like everything was slowly burning. She stood at the window for a while, then turned and began memorizing the layout of the rooms. She found 2 observation points that she assumed were monitoring equipment. She did nothing about them. She behaved exactly as a woman in this situation was expected to behave, which meant she read, sat quietly, and went to sleep early. She found Davin 3 days later during the morning period when the household servants moved through the East Wing corridors. He passed her in a hallway without slowing, and a folded note dropped from his sleeve to the floor near her foot. She picked it up and put it in her pocket without looking at it. The note said, "Vault entrance confirmed subterranean. East quarter, below the old temple. Guard rotation every 4 hours. Working on access mapping." She burned the note. The archivist appeared on the 5th day, which was faster than she had expected. His name was Vorith Kell, and he was old by Dorith standards, which meant he moved slowly and his battle scarring had faded to pale lines on dark skin, and his eyes had the particular quality of someone who had spent most of his life reading and not enough of it sleeping. He came to her rooms under the official pretense of delivering the household historical records that a new bonded consort was traditionally expected to review. He set the records down, looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not yet read clearly, and then said in careful, slightly formal Dorith, "You understand me." It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for another moment. "How long have you been studying the language?" "For months." He was quiet. He seemed to be calculating something. Then he said, "That is not very long." "No," she agreed. He picked up one of the record tablets he had brought, turned it over in his hands, and set it back down. "The records I have brought you are the approved household history. They are accurate as far as they go. They do not go very far." He paused. "If you were to visit the public archive in the Citadel's central tower, you would find records that go somewhat further. If you were to ask for the pre-conquest records specifically, which most consorts would not think to do, you would find things that are," he paused again, longer this time educational. He left after that, unhurried. Lyra sat with the household records in her lap and thought about what he had not said. The bonding challenge came at the end of the 2nd week. It was informal, which meant it was meant to humiliate rather than to test. A group of 4 younger noble males arrived at the dinner gathering where Lyra was present as was required, and the eldest of them, a warrior named Doric Vel, whose ritual scarring was fresh and whose ego was evident, set a large ceremonial cup in front of her without asking. "It is tradition," he said loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "to offer our new household member the binding cup. For strength. For belonging." He smiled. The smile was the kind that meant he expected her to refuse or to choke or to embarrass herself, and he intended to enjoy watching whichever one it was. The binding cup was a Dorith ritual spirit made from fermented grain and something else that Lyra had read about, and that she knew could put a large Dorith male flat on the floor for 6 hours. She looked at the cup. She looked at Doric Vel. She picked the cup up and drank it in 3 long swallows. The room went very still. She set the cup down without any expression on her face. She felt the liquid hit her stomach like a stone dropped from height, and then felt the heat of it spread up through her chest and into her skull in a wave that made her vision briefly waver at the edges. She did not let any of that show. "Thank you," she said in Dorith, pleasantly, "for the welcome." Doric Vel stared at her. Rovan, across the room, watched all of this. His expression did not change, but his eyes tracked her for the rest of the evening in a way they had not before. Later, alone in her room, Lyra sat very still on the edge of the bed and breathed carefully until the worst of it passed. She was briefly, seriously ill. It lasted about 20 minutes. She kept a cloth over her mouth and did not make a sound, and when it was over she drank all the water she could manage and lay flat until the room stopped moving. Then she got up and went to her desk and wrote notes about the evening for 40 minutes before she went back to sleep. She had made a mistake at the dinner table, not the cup that had been necessary. She had underestimated how well she could hide the effect. She would not make that error again. She revised her estimate of the binding cup's toxicity upward and added it to the list of variables she was tracking. Dorith Prime glowed orange through her window, and somewhere in the city below, in a chamber beneath a temple she had not yet found, something old was waiting in the dark. She intended to find it before anyone else decided what to do with it. It rained on Dorith Prime in a way that felt personal. The water came down heavy and warm, the color of weak tea, carrying something mineral that stained the pale stone of the citadel's lower walkways in long reddish streaks. The Dorith did not seem to notice it. They moved through the rain without shelter, shaking it off the way large animals shake off water, indifferent. Lyra, by contrast, was not permitted to go out in it at all. The household rules for a bonded consort did not include wandering around the capital in a rainstorm, so she watched it from the archive window and thought about what she had spent the last 3 weeks learning. Vorith Kel had been careful. He gave her things in layers, the way you teach a child to swim, first the shallows, then the depth, watching each time to see if she could keep her head above the surface. He started with general Dorith history, the formation of the empire, the conquest campaigns, the slow absorption of 11 other species over 400 years. He gave her the official record, and then, a few days later, he gave her the other record, the one that noted which parts of the official version had been rewritten and when. He watched her face the whole time. She knew he was doing it and let him. She was being evaluated. She did not mind being evaluated. She generally passed. On the 4th week, he brought her to a section of the archive that required a key he carried on his person. The room inside was small and cold, and the shelves held physical tablets rather than digital records, which meant they predated the systems the Dorith currently used and were not indexed in any way the Citadel's network could search. He lit a lamp. He set 3 tablets on the reading table. "These are the founding records of the Doric Vault," he said. "They are not available to anyone below the Grand Council. I have access because I am the archivist, and because the previous archivist was my teacher, and because his teacher before him decided that someone in this building should always know what these say, even if no one is permitted to act on what they know." He looked at her across the table. "I am going to tell you what they contain. I would like you to tell me, when I am done, whether your species has any concept of what I am describing." Lyra sat down. "Go ahead." What Vorith Kel told her over the next 2 hours rearranged several things she had assumed about the situation she was in. The Doric was not a god. It had never been a god. The Dorith religion that had grown up around it was a protective fiction, built deliberately by the Dorith ancestors who had first found it to ensure that no one would ever be curious or ambitious enough to try to use it. They had taken something that terrified them and wrapped it in ceremony and forbidden it, and called it sacred, which was, Lyra reflected, a very old and very human approach to a problem, though she did not say that aloud. What they had found was a machine. It had been built by a civilization that had existed before the Dorith, a people who left no other record of themselves because the machine had, in the end, ensured there was nothing left to make records with. It was designed to end wars by ending the side that started them, completely and permanently, by targeting every biological signature of that species within a defined radius and eliminating it. The builders had created it as a deterrent. They had activated it once. The radius had been larger than they calculated. The machine had not distinguished between the enemy and the people standing next to the enemy, or the people standing next to them, or the people standing very far away who simply had the wrong biology. Billions of people had died. Then the machine had run out of targets and gone dormant. The Dorith ancestors who found it, centuries later, had been wise enough to understand what they were looking at. They sealed it. They built the temple above it. They built the religion around the temple. They wrote the founding records and hid them in a room that required a key and told the key holder to never, under any circumstances, tell anyone what was below the floor. The system had worked for 400 years. Grand Inquisitor Saith, Vorith Kel said, setting the 3rd tablet down, has been working to dismantle the religious prohibition for 30 years. He is not a man who believes in gods. He believes in weapons. He has spent 3 decades reclassifying the Doric in the academic and military record, quietly, one paper at a time, one promoted officer at a time, removing the people who maintained the prohibition and replacing them with people who did not. Lyra was quiet for a moment. And the machine. What does it need to activate? Vorithkel folded his hands on the table. That is the part, he said carefully, that I believe is relevant to your being here. The Doric was old. Its original activation sequence had been designed by the civilization that built it for that civilization's biology. 400 years of dormancy had degraded several of its core systems. Satha's engineers had spent years working on it in secret and had concluded that the machine could not be reactivated by any biological material it had already encountered. It had processed Dorith biology. It had processed the biology of every species the pre-Dorith civilization had encountered. Its catalyst system would not accept them. It needed something new. Something it has never seen, Lyra said. A sapient biological catalyst from a species it has no prior record of, Vorithkel confirmed. A meaningful quantity of blood introduced to the sensor array. The machine's initialization protocol would use it to calibrate target parameters. He paused. The Dorith have encountered no new sapient species in over 100 years. Until us, Lyra said. Until the treaty delegation arrived, yes. And then Satha argued, very persuasively, before the Grand Council, that a human-bonded consort would be a natural diplomatic exchange, that it would cement the peace, that it would demonstrate good faith. Vorithkel looked at her steadily. The treaty was his proposal. The specific requirement a royal daughter of the ruling family to be installed in the citadel specifically was his addition. The room was very quiet. Outside, the rain continued. Lyra sat with what she had just been told and let it settle the way you let a weight settle onto a scale. She was not afraid. She noted that she was not afraid, which was interesting. She had been afraid before in the field, in difficult situations, and the absence of it now was not numbness. It was something more like resolution. The shape of the problem had clarified. She knew what she was dealing with. Vorithkel was watching her. I expected more reaction, he said. I come from a species that was nearly wiped out 7 times before we reached space, she said. Plague, ice, fire, ourselves. We panicked all of those times. We learned that panic does not stop the countdown. She looked at him. Planning does. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, I did not know what I expected when I came to your rooms on the 5th day. I knew only that I had spent 40 years reading history, and that humans are the only species I have ever read about that I cannot predict. Every other species the Empire has encountered, I could model the response. With your kind, I find I cannot. He picked up one of the tablets. I thought perhaps that was why Saith chose you specifically. Because you are unpredictable. Or, Lyra said, he chose us because we were new and he needed new. He is not accounting for the same thing you are. Which is, that unpredictable goes both ways. She asked him for paper and began writing before she left the archive, in her shorthand that looked like nothing. She had a channel to Davin. She had used it once, to confirm she was alive and the mission was proceeding. She used it again that night, encoding the transmission in 3 layers of cipher and keeping it to 30 seconds. Davin's reply came 6 hours later. 2 words. Understood. Ready. She read it and sat back in her chair. The interface spike he had smuggled in was in the hollow base of her writing desk, wrapped in insulating cloth. She had known it was there for weeks. She had been waiting to understand whether she would need it. She understood now. She had maybe 2 weeks before Saith moved. He was a patient man who had spent 30 years building toward this moment, but he was also a man who had nearly everything in place, and nearly everything had a tendency to make careful men impatient. She needed to be ready before he was. She opened the writing desk and unwrapped the interface spike and held it in both hands for a moment, looking at it. It was a small thing, matte gray metal, about the length and width of 2 fingers, unremarkable to look at. Terran Xenotech. Classified. It had been built by an engineering team in response to a theoretical scenario that no one had really believed would ever actually occur. She believed it now. She put it back and closed the desk and went to the window. Dorith Prime burned orange in the dark below her, and somewhere under the temple, something was dreaming in the language of a dead civilization, waiting for blood it had never tasted. She intended to be the one who decided what it woke up to. They came for her at the third hour of the Dorith night, which was the quietest hour, the hour when even the sentries moved slowly. She was not asleep. She had not slept in 31 hours, not because she could not, but because something in the base of her skull had been sending steady, quiet signals for the past 2 days that Safe was moving faster than she had estimated. There was nothing she could point to specifically. It was the quality of the silences in the hallways outside her rooms. It was the way certain servants had stopped meeting her eyes. It was the fact that Vorith Kell had not come to the archive for 3 days when he had come every day for 6 weeks. So she was sitting at her desk in the dark, fully dressed, with the interface spike tucked into the inside of her left sleeve and her hands folded on the table, when the door opened. There were 7 of them. For soldiers in Dorith temple armor, which was heavier than standard military issue, and painted with the Doricus sigil. 2 priests in the red ceremonial cloth that indicated a rite of significant importance. And behind them, taking up rather more space than seemed necessary even for a Dorith, Grand Inquisitor Saith himself. He was not what she had expected when she had seen him at the court dinner weeks ago. He was not physically imposing. He was medium height for a Dorith, which meant he was still taller than her, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now merely authoritative. His eyes were the dark amber that older Dorith sometimes developed, and he wore no ceremonial scarring, which marked him as someone who had decided his power did not require display. He looked at her sitting at her desk in the dark, and something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly, more like recalculation. "You are awake," he said. "I am," she agreed. "That is unusual. I sleep lightly." He studied her for a moment. Then he produced a document and held it out, not to her, but to the room in general, a performance for an audience she realized was probably being recorded. "By the authority of the Grand Council's sacred mandate," he said in a formal register of Dorith she had only read in old texts. "The bonded human consort of Warlord Rovan is hereby summoned to the Doric ceremony of renewal to participate in the sacred rite of offering. This is an honor," he added, with exactly the tone of someone who knows they are describing something that is not an honor at all. The 2 priests moved forward with chains. Ceremonial ones, she noted. Polished, not functional restraints. She let them put the chains around her wrists because removing that variable from the situation was more useful than fighting over it here, in this room, where she had no advantage. She stood up and walked with them. The halls of the Citadel at night were different from the Citadel she had spent 2 months moving through during the day. The lights were low, the orange mineral glow of the stone more visible, everything quieter and somehow denser, as though the building held its breath at night. They took her down 2 levels via a staircase she had not used before, then through a corridor that dead-ended at what looked like a blank wall, until Saith pressed 3 points on the stone in sequence and a section of it swung inward. The passage beyond was old, older than the citadel built above it. The stone was different, darker, harder, smooth in the way that meant it had been shaped by tools far better than anything the Dorith currently used. The air was cool and still and tasted faintly of ozone. Lyra counted steps, counted turns, built the map in her head. The vault was at the end of a descent that took 12 minutes at the pace they were walking. She heard it before she saw it, a low sound at the edge of what she could hear, something that wasn't quite a hum and wasn't quite a vibration, something that existed somewhere between sound and feeling in the chest. Then the passage opened up and she saw it. She had read descriptions. She had built a picture in her head from Vorith Kell's words and the archive tablets and everything she had been able to find in her research. The picture had not been large enough. The vault was a cathedral. Not in the human sense. There was no architecture here built for worship, no deliberate beauty, no attempt at the divine. But the scale was cathedral scale, massive in the way that made her feel physically smaller, a space carved from rock that went up beyond where the lamplight reached. And at the center of it, filling perhaps a third of the floor space, was the Doric. It was not beautiful. It was the opposite of beautiful in the way that very dangerous things often are, purposeful to a degree that made aesthetics irrelevant. It was a machine built in a geometry she did not have immediate language for, all angles and no curves, dense with components she could not name, covered in a layer of accumulated age that should have made it look dead, but did not, because even standing here at the entrance she could feel it was not dead. It was dormant. Those were different things. It was breathing, in the way that machines breathe, in the flow of some internal process that had been running for 4 centuries in the dark. Saith walked her to the central interface point, a raised dais at the base of the machine, and the priests took their positions around it. He produced a ritual blade. Ceremonial, again, but the edge on it was real. "This will be recorded as an act of sacred honor," Saith said. "Your name will be entered in the temple records as a participant in the Doric renewal. It is, for your kind, a significant distinction." "How kind?" Lyra said. He looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of respect, or might have been the end of patience. Then he nodded to one of the priests. The priest reached for her wrist. Lyra broke the man's grip, stepped left, put her elbow into the second priest's throat with enough force to take him briefly off his feet, and pulled the interface spike from her sleeve with her other hand in the same motion. She had 3 seconds before the soldiers moved. She used all of them. The first soldier went down because Davin hit him from the shadow behind the nearest column, which meant Davin had been in position for longer than she had been in the room, which was exactly what she had counted on. The second and third went down in the same motion because Davin was very good at his job, and she had not given him this assignment because he was average. The fourth got a hand on her before Davin reached him, and Lyra drove the heel of her hand up under his jaw, and he let go. Saith did not run. He drew the ritual blade and put it across her forearm. It cut deeper than she wanted. She had applied a field coagulant to the inside of both forearms before they came for her, pressed into the skin in a thin layer, because she had not known which arm he would go for, but she had known he was going to cut her, and she had known why. The coagulant would not stop the bleeding entirely. It would slow it. It would give her time. The blood hit the Doricus sensor array. The machine changed. It did not start up the way a machine starts up. There was no sequence of lights, no rising sound, no sequence of obvious steps. It simply became more present, the way a sleeping animal becomes more present when it wakes, the whole of it attending suddenly to the room around it. That low not quite sound rising in frequency until she could feel it in her back teeth. Saith watched this with an expression of deep and complicated satisfaction. Then he looked at Lyra, bleeding and held between 2 of the soldiers who had gotten back up, and said, "You cannot stop what has already begun. You are one human, alone, in a room surrounded by my people, and the Doric will wake regardless of what you do next." Lyra pulled the interface spike fully into her grip and looked at the machine. The sensor array was directly in front of her, approximately 4 feet away, at the front face of the main chassis. She looked at it the way you look at a problem you have been thinking about for a long time when you finally have it in front of you. "I'm not trying to stop it," she said. "I'm trying to aim it." She moved. The interface spike had no instructions printed on it. The team that built it had considered adding instructions and then decided that anyone who would be using it would either already know what to do or would be dead before it mattered. Lyra pressed it against the Doricus sensor array and felt it lock in with a sound that was not a click, exactly, more like the feeling of a door finding its frame. What happened next was hard to describe because it did not happen to her body. It happened to everything behind her eyes. The Doric was old. She had understood this intellectually, had read the records, had done the mathematics of 400 years in a sealed room. She had not understood it in any way that felt real until the machine's awareness turned toward her, and she understood it the same way she would understand a desert by standing in the middle of one. It was enormous. It was patient in a way that had nothing to do with choice and everything to do with having no concept of urgency. It had been waiting because waiting was what it did when it had no target, and it had had no target in a very long time, and now it had blood. It reached for her the way a searchlight reaches for something, not gently, not with any particular interest in her as an individual, but with absolute focus and the simple intention of using what it had found. Lyra held on. She had been briefed on what the Xenotech team called neurological immersion feedback, which was their careful way of saying that connecting a human mind to an alien machine intelligence of unknown depth was going to feel like standing in a river that was moving faster than she could swim. The briefing had been accurate, but incomplete. It did not feel like a river. It felt like the river was inside her skull, and she was the riverbed. Davin's voice came from somewhere outside the sensation. Pull out. Pull out now. Lyra, let go of the... She could not let go. Not yet. Not until she had done what she came to do. The Doric was initializing. She could feel it the way you feel heat from something you haven't touched. The machine was running through its targeting sequence, and it was enormous, and it was indiscriminate, and it was aiming at everything within its radius with the same patient totality it had used 400 years ago when it had killed billions of people for the crime of being within range of a war they had not started. She could not shut it down. She had known this from the beginning. The engineers on Earth had looked at everything Vorethkel's records described and said, very clearly and without apology, that remote shutdown was not achievable. The machine was too self-contained, too old, too foreign for any approach that required understanding the full architecture. But they had thought about what else might be possible. What they had given her was not a shutdown tool. It was a translation tool, a system designed to find the input layer of an unknown machine intelligence and offer it something it had been missing, a definition of enemy. The Doric had last operated with targeting parameters set by the people who built it, set for a war that was over 4 centuries before any current Dorith was born. It had blood now, new blood, blood from a new species. And in its initialization logic, it was treating everything alive within range as a valid target because it had no instructions to do otherwise. What Lyra was trying to give it was instructions, not a shutdown, not a redirect in any elegant sense. What she was trying to do was find something in the machine's logic that functioned like a target selector and point it at something specific, narrow it down from everything to something, give it a reason to wait rather than fire. She found it in the same way you find a door in a dark room, by running your hands along the wall until you feel the edge of it. The Doric's target selection layer was not complex. It was very old logic, simple in the way that very powerful things are often simple. It asked, what is the enemy? It had been given an answer 400 years ago, and the answer had been, everything alive. It had run that protocol. It had finished. It had gone dormant because there were no more targets. It was prepared to run it again. Lyra was trying to give it a shorter answer. The machine was fighting her, not intelligently, not with any awareness of her as a threat, but the way a river fights anything that tries to divert it, with nothing more than its own weight and continuity. She felt it moving through the connection, and she felt the connection trying to widen, to use her as a channel rather than as an argument, to draw on her blood as a power source rather than as a communication. She bled more. The coagulant was losing the fight. Lyra. Davin's voice was closer now. He had finished with the soldiers. He was next to her. She could feel his hand on her shoulder without being fully able to feel her shoulder. You need to disconnect. You're losing blood. Lyra, listen to me. She found the door. It was not a door. It was a logic gate, an old one, in a language that her translation tool interpreted as conditional. If this, then that. If enemy is defined, then target enemy. If enemy is not defined, then target all. She fed it a definition, not in words, in the biological data that her own blood was already providing. The machine had her biology now, had read it in the first seconds of contact. She used the fact that the machine had recognized her species as new, as unknown, as not in its original parameters, and she built a conditional around it. If this biology, then not enemy. Then she built the inverse. If Dorith biology matching Satha's cult bloodline pattern, then enemy. She had Satha's genetic profile from the Citadel medical records she had lifted 6 weeks ago, filed under a section she was not supposed to have access to and had accessed anyway. The machine considered this. 400 years of dormancy. Then blood. Then a new species trying to teach it something. It was not a thinking machine. It did not reason. But it processed, and what it processed was the definition it had been given, and what it found was that the definition was narrower than everything alive, and it accepted narrower because narrower was a definition and no definition was not. The targeting array shifted. Safe, who had been watching from across the vault chamber where 2 of Davin's improvised restraints were keeping him from doing anything useful, heard the sound the machine made when it found its new target set and went absolutely still. What did you do? He said. It was not a question. I told it what to shoot, Lyra said. Her voice sounded, even to her own ears, like something being said from a significant distance. She held the connection for 11 more minutes. She held it because she could feel the machine's selection logic was not fully locked, that if she let go too soon the conditional she had built would collapse, and it would return to all targets. And so she held on while the Doric began its slow and terrible process of doing what it had been designed to do. aimed now at the ships in orbit that matched Satha's cult fleet profile, at the temple fortresses across the capital, at the defense installations that had been quietly converted to Satha's use over 30 years of patient subversion. Davin held the spike steady for her. He said nothing. He had seen a lot of things in 12 years of field operations, and he knew when to talk and when to not. At minute 9, the vault's own internal defense systems came online, re-aimed by the same targeting cascade, and turned their attention to Saith. Saith ran. The door behind him had closed when the machine woke. It did not open now. The Doric did what the Doric did. Upstairs, Rovan had been woken at the first sound and had spent 40 minutes holding a document in his hands that promised him a title in exchange for his compliance and his consort's delivery. He was a man who had earned every scar on his face, and he was not, when it came down to the question in front of him, a man who would trade what he had for a title. He put the document down. He called his household guard. He led them through the citadel towards Satha's forces, and it was a brutal and unpleasant thing, and he was very good at it. And by the time Lyra finally disconnected in the vault below and let Davin catch her before she hit the floor, the battle upstairs was effectively over. She was conscious when they came down. Barely. Davin had tied off her arm, and she was holding the field coagulant tight against the cut, and the worst of the blood loss had slowed. She looked at the Doric. It was dormant again. Not sealed, the original seal was gone, and she did not think it could be put back. But the targeting had completed, and the targets were gone, and it had nothing left to run. It sat in the dark, enormous and patient and terrible, and it breathed its not quite breathing, and it waited. "Tell my father we bought more than a decade," she said. Davin, who was very carefully not showing how frightened he had been for the last 11 minutes, said, "You can tell him yourself." She thought about that. "Yes," she agreed. "That's better." He helped her up the stairs. The first thing Lyra asked for, before the Citadel physician had finished closing the cut on her arm, was a datapad. The physician, who was the most senior medical professional in the Dorith capital and who had not previously been called to treat a human patient and who was visibly uncertain about several aspects of the situation, looked at her the way you look at someone who has said something so unexpected that you need a moment to confirm you heard it correctly. "You have a significant laceration," he said. "I know," she said. "I was there." The datapad. He brought it. She had the outline of the revised treaty drafted in note form before he finished bandaging her arm. The Citadel in the 48 hours after the Dorcas activation was not a place that operated in any normal sense. Satha's faction had held covert influence over a third of the Dorith Fleet Command, which meant a third of the Fleet Command was suddenly leaderless and in various stages of deciding what to do about that. The temple cult structure that Saith had spent 30 years building had collapsed in a single night, not because Lyra had dismantled it, but because the machine it worshipped had aimed itself at it, which was a theological problem that no surviving member of the cult seemed to know how to address. Rovan's forces held the Citadel by morning. He was not, technically, supposed to do that. There were protocols for the transfer of political authority, and he had followed approximately none of them, but the Grand Council, reviewing the situation from their various secure locations around the capital, made the collective decision that the man who had actually maintained physical control of the seat of government during the crisis had a reasonable argument for being listened to, and they came to him rather than the reverse. Lyra was in the medical rooms for 2 days. On the 3rd day, she moved to a chair. On the 5th day, she was back at a desk. Davin brought her food and gave her his field reports in 15-minute briefings twice a day, standing at the window with his back to the room in the professional habit of someone who had learned not to face a door. He had been operating in the Citadel for 2 months, and he had built up an information network that was, by his own modest assessment, pretty good. "Dorith Fleet is stabilizing," he said on the 2nd briefing. "Rovan's people have control of the 3 orbital stations. Satha's remaining ships either surrendered in the first 12 hours or are in retreat toward the outer territories. The Grand Council is scared." He paused. "Which is useful. Have they read the preliminary treaty draft?" Vorith Kell delivered it personally. He paused again. He walked into the council chamber without being invited, which I'm told is not done, and he put the Human History Archive on the table, which I'm told is also not done, and then he sat down and didn't say anything. He just let them read. Lyra thought about this and felt something she did not fully have a word for. Not quite warmth. Something quieter than that. "Good man," she said. The council requested a meeting on the 6th day. Lyra went to it in a chair because she could not yet stand for long periods, and she was not going to fall over in front of the Dorith Grand Council, which meant a chair was the correct tactical choice, and she did not particularly care what it looked like. There were 9 of them. They ranged from old to ancient, and they looked at her the way the noble class had looked at her on the day she arrived, like something unexpected and not quite categorizable. The difference was that the noble class had been contemptuous and the Grand Council was not. They were trying very hard not to be afraid, which was, Lyra reflected, at least a form of respect. She was polite. She was specific. She had the notes, and she had Davin standing behind her left shoulder, and she had 2 months of Dorith cultural fluency, and the treaty she laid out was nothing like the one she had arrived with. It was not punitive. Humanity did not need the Dorith on their knees. What humanity needed, what Lyra had always understood the goal to be, was time and space. Time to build the fleet that the generals needed. Space to expand the colonies without the threat of extermination. Access to Dorith trade routes. An end to the classification of humans as a lesser species in Dorith diplomatic records. The removal of the treaty's original submission language. And one additional clause, which she added at the end, and which caused a particular silence in the room. The Dorith was to be sealed again, properly, under joint human Dorith custody, with Vorith Kell as the Dorith archivist of record and a human representative to be named later. The activation records were to be preserved and locked, and the key was to exist only in 2 places, the Dorith Archive and the Terran Sovereign Republic's deep storage. So that no one, she said, on either side, is ever tempted again. The eldest council member, a woman named Sorith who had not spoken until this moment, said, "You are offering us co-custody of the most dangerous weapon in the known galaxy." "I am offering us co-responsibility for the most dangerous weapon in the known galaxy," Lyra said. "Those are different things." There was a long pause. Then Sorith said, "We will review the terms." The treaty was signed 3 days later. Sorith signed it without further debate, which Davin said later was faster than he had expected. What Davin did not know, and what Lyra learned only afterward, was that Sorith had read the Dorith physician's medical report the same morning. She had read the notation about the laceration and the hairline fracture and the neurological overload and the dislocated shoulder that the patient had reset herself without interruption to her other activities. She had read the final line, which noted that the patient had requested a datapad before she would accept sedation. Sorith had folded the report very precisely and signed the treaty 40 minutes later. The day Lyra left Dorith Prime was clear and cold, with the kind of light that fell flat across everything and made the city look like a detailed model of itself. She walked to the transport dock with Davin 2 paces behind her and Vorith Kell beside her, who had come to say goodbye and to give her a physical copy of the complete Dorith pre-conquest archives, translated into standard Terran by his own hand over the past 3 weeks, which was the most genuine and generous thing anyone had done for her in a very long time. She held the archive under her arm and shook his hand, which surprised him. Dorith did not shake hands. He looked at his hand after, with an expression that suggested he was filing the experience away somewhere. Rovan was at the dock. He did not say much. He was not a man who said much even when there was a great deal to say, and she had spent 2 months learning this about him and respecting it. He stood at the edge of the boarding walkway with his hands at his sides and looked at her with the same expression he had been looking at her with for weeks. The expression she had finally correctly identified as someone who had encountered something they did not have a prior category for and had not yet built one. "I do not understand your species," he said. "Most species don't," she said. "At first. Does that change?" She thought about it. "It depends on whether they survive long enough to learn." She looked at him. "I think you will." She walked up the boarding ramp. She did not look back. Not because she did not want to, but because there was a navigation screen at the end of the walkway, and she had already calculated the transit time home, and she wanted to review the treaty language one more time before she slept. Her father met her on the landing platform. He was the president of the Terran Sovereign Republic. He had advisors and security personnel and a press contingent and a full diplomatic reception committee waiting inside. And he walked through all of them and down the platform steps to where she was still walking, and he held her, and she let him, and they stood on the open platform with the earth wind moving around them, and neither of them said anything for a while. Later, She sat in her old room in the presidential residence with the Dorothy archive open in her lap and the window showing the night sky. The stars were visible, clear, and numerous, the same stars that looked different from the other side of the distance between them. Out there was a galaxy that was very old and very large, and that had, for most of human history, not considered humanity worth considering. That calculation was shifting now, slowly, the way large things shift, which was not quickly but was irreversibly. Humanity had bought time. Not peace exactly, not security, not any guarantee of anything. Just time, which was what humans had always needed and had always, when they could get it, known exactly what to do with. In a council chamber on Dorothy Prime, a physician's report sat in a file on Sortha's desk. She had not thrown it away. She had read it 3 times and filed it carefully, the way you file something you intend to remember. The report said, in the dry language of Dorothy medical record keeping, that the human female had sustained multiple injuries during the night of the Doric event, had refused sedation until provided with a writing instrument, and had been noted by the attending physician to be drafting what appeared to be a formal document at the time the sedative was finally administered. Sorth had added a single annotation to the file in her own handwriting. It said, "Do not underestimate them again." She had underlined it. On Earth, Lyra turned a page of the archive, and the stars outside her window watched her read, and the galaxy continued its slow and reluctant revision of what it thought it knew about the small, determined, thoroughly inconvenient people of the third planet. They had bought their time. They would use every second of it.